For more than half a century, the world believed it knew Paul Newman, the blue eyes, the perfect marriage, the loyal husband, the devoted father, the moral compass of Hollywood. But at 63 years old, his daughter, Nell Newman, finally broke the silence. And what she revealed sent shockwaves through Hollywood. It didn't come from a tabloid. It didn't come from a bitter lawsuit. It came from a calm, devastating interview on CBS Sunday Morning, and in just a few carefully chosen words, Nell Newman quietly dismantled the myth the world had worshipped. She didn't accuse, she didn't scream, she didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth. A truth that suggested Paul Newman's famous marriage was not what it appeared to be. A truth that hinted his greatest love may never have been his wife, and a truth that pointed to a secret so dangerous it followed him to his grave. Because when Paul Newman died, his final will did something no one expected. It didn't honor his wife of 50 years, Joanne Woodward. It didn't prioritize his children. It didn't protect the family legacy. Instead, it left everything to a single mysterious name. 2 letters, RR. No explanation, no clarification, no goodbye. Who was RR, and why would one of Hollywood's most admired men quietly erase his own family at the very end? According to Nell, the answer wasn't found in legal documents. It was buried deep inside a beautiful mansion in Westport, Connecticut, where silence was enforced, questions were forbidden, and love was something no one ever spoke about. That house looked perfect from the outside. Awards on the walls, smiling photos in golden frames, famous friends passing through the doors. But behind closed doors, Nell says something felt wrong from the very beginning. She never once saw her parents hold hands, never heard "I love you" spoken out loud, and never felt warmth when the cameras were gone. What the world saw as the ultimate Hollywood romance was in reality a performance held together by secrets, fear, and a love that could never be named. And as Nell would eventually discover, the truth her father hid wasn't just about who he loved. It was about what that silence destroyed, including her brother, including her mother, and possibly including Paul Newman himself. So the question is no longer whether Paul Newman had secrets. The real question is, why did those secrets cost his family everything? By the time Nell reached the end of this journey, she stopped expecting a clean answer, because nothing about her father's life was clean. Not the marriage, not the silences, not the faces people praised on television, not the way the world mourned a legend while his family kept bleeding in private. What Nell was left with wasn't a confession. It was fragments, shards scattered across decades like broken glass. A brother who begged for truth and died without it. A mother who carried betrayal so long it became part of her breath. A father who lived behind locked doors, hidden letters, late-night calls, and names that never belonged to the story the public was sold. Scott. That name never stopped haunting her, because when people say Scott died from drugs, Nell hears something else. She hears the sound of a boy growing up inside a mansion full of trophies and feeling invisible. She hears the sound of a son asking the one question that could have saved him and getting nothing back but silence. He didn't just lose his future, he lost his identity. Because when your father's love is a mystery, you start believing you were never meant to exist in the first place. And then there was Joanne Woodward, the woman the world called the greatest partner a man could ever have. Graceful, loyal, devoted. But behind closed doors, Nell watched her mother become smaller year by year, like love was something she had to beg for in her own house. And when the illness finally took her memories, the cruelest part was what they stayed behind. Not birthdays, not family milestones, not the golden romance the public adored, but one name, Robert. A name that refused to disappear even as everything else faded. That's what broke Nell the most, because it made her realize her mother's pain wasn't imagined. It wasn't jealousy. It was a quiet truth she had been forced to swallow until it poisoned her from the inside. And then there were the men nobody could prove, the men nobody dared name, the letter that began with Dear Red, the hotel rooms, the late-night laughter that never belonged to the family, the hand on the wrist, the look in the hallway. None of it came with a signed confession, but Nell didn't need a confession anymore, because once you've lived inside a secret long enough, you learn the difference between rumor and reality. Rumor sounds noisy. Reality sounds quiet. Reality sounds like a study door locking. Reality sounds like footsteps leaving at dawn. Reality sounds like your mother crying behind the bedroom door while your father sits downstairs and pretends he can't hear it. And the final will, that's what made everything feel final in the worst way. Because even if the will was manipulated, even if the paperwork was rewritten, even if the truth is more complicated than anyone will ever admit, the result was the same. The family was left outside the story. The myth was protected, and the silence won again. Nell's anger didn't come from greed. It came from grief, because she wasn't fighting for money. She was fighting for meaning. She was fighting for the right to say, my father was human. He was complicated. He was torn. He was not the perfect symbol you worshipped. And he didn't just leave behind films. He left behind damage. He left behind questions. He left behind children who grew up wondering if love in their home was ever real at all. That is the part the world never sees. When the spotlight goes off, the legend stays shiny, but the family stays broken. And now, decades later, Nell still sits with the same thought in the quiet moments. Not rage, not revenge, just one aching, impossible wish that her father had once been brave enough to sit down, look his children in the eyes, and tell them the truth, because the truth might have hurt, but it would have been an ending. Instead, Nell was left with an unfinished story and a lifetime of silence. And that silence turns into one final question she can't stop asking, and neither can the audience. If the man the world called integrity couldn't live honestly with the people who loved him most, then what does that say about the masks we all wear? And what secret are we protecting that might cost us everything before it's too late? Now it's your turn. Do you believe Paul Newman was protecting his family or protecting himself? And do you think the final will was truly his decision? Drop your thoughts below, because the truth might not be in the documents. It might be in what you feel when you hear this story. Before you leave, ask yourself this. If you had one truth to say to your family, would you say it before it's too late? From the outside, the Newman estate in Westport, Connecticut, looked like a dream carved out of privilege. Tall gates, manicured lawns, ancient oak trees casting long, elegant shadows across a mansion built for legends. This was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. But for Nell Newman, this house never felt warm. It felt watchful. As a child, she would sit beneath the old oak tree with a sketch pad, drawing quietly, sensing things she didn't yet have words for. Even surrounded by luxury, there was a tension in the air that never lifted, like the walls themselves were listening. In that house, questions were dangerous. Asking the wrong one could cost you affection. Asking too many could cost you love. For years, Nell believed what the photographs told her. Smiling parents, red carpet moments. A marriage Hollywood held up as proof that true love could survive fame, but photos don't speak. And neither did her family. Looking back, Nell realized something chilling. In all her childhood memories, she had never once seen her parents hold hands when no cameras were around. Every public embrace was stiff, calculated, like actors hitting their marks before the director yelled, "Cut." Once the doors closed, the performance ended. Her father, adored by millions, became distant and cold. Those famous blue eyes that melted audiences went flat at home, empty of warmth. When he entered a room, the air thickened. Conversations slowed, smiles disappeared. Her mother, Joanne, seemed to shrink in his presence, tense, guarded, like someone constantly bracing for impact. One afternoon, Nell reached for her mother's hand and asked softly, "Are you sad?" Joanne recoiled instantly, as if burned, not angry, not cruel, just unreachable. At dawn, Paul would leave the house without a word, no explanation, no note. Sometimes he vanished for days, sometimes weeks. And when he returned, he offered only a hollow smile before retreating into his study, locking the door behind him. That locked door became a symbol. Behind it, Nell would hear laughter echo through the hallway. A deep, genuine laugh she never heard at the dinner table, a laugh that didn't belong to her mother's world. Whoever was on the other end of those late-night phone calls, it was never Joanne. Then came the night that shattered Nell's innocence forever. It was 1972. A sudden sharp crack tore through the house, the sound of glass exploding like a scream in the dark. Nell ran toward the noise and found her mother on the floor, blood on her hand, gripping a jagged shard of a shattered wine glass. Joanne's voice trembled as she whispered over and over, "You lied again, you lied again." Terrified, Nell asked the question she had never dared to ask before. "What did Dad do?" Joanne's lips shook. Her eyes filled with something heavier than anger. And then she said the sentence that carved itself into Nell's memory like ice. "Not every man loves women, darling, but Hollywood will never accept that." That moment changed everything. Days later, while searching through her father's belongings, Nell found something no one was ever meant to see. A worn Polaroid, hidden deep inside his wallet. In the photo, her father was smiling brighter than she had ever seen him smile at home. His arm was wrapped around another man, close, intimate, unguarded. Those eyes weren't acting, they were in love. Shaking, Nell showed the photo to her mother. Joanne didn't hesitate. She snatched it away, ripped it into pieces, and fed it into the fire, whispering through clenched teeth, "We will never speak of this. Never." From that day on, the rules were clear. Don't ask where he goes. Don't ask why mom needs pills to sleep. Don't ask why they live on separate floors. And above all, never ask about love. The house was filled with Oscars, movie posters, and praise from the world. But according to Nell, not one of those walls ever spoke of happiness. And as she would soon learn, the silence in that house didn't just protect secrets, it destroyed the people trapped inside it. The first person in the Newman family to truly break under the weight of silence wasn't Nell. It was her older brother, Scott Newman. To the outside world, Scott was Paul Newman's son. Handsome, rebellious, charismatic. Hollywood called him a younger echo of his father. But inside the house, Scott saw something no one else wanted to name. From an early age, he noticed the cracks, the absence of affection, the way his father walked past his mother's tears as if they weren't there, the way "I love you" was never returned. When a Scott told his father he loved him, Paul would smirk, then look away. That silence hurt more than rejection. As Scott grew older, the questions grew louder. Why had he never seen his parents hold hands? Why did his father disappear for days without explanation? Why was he always surrounded by men who felt like more than friends? Those questions turned into anger. At night, while Joanne cried behind her locked bedroom door, Scott would lose control downstairs, smashing his guitar until the neck snapped clean in two. The sound echoed through the house like a warning. Paul never came upstairs, never intervened, never asked what was wrong. He sat alone, staring at the television, drink in hand, pretending he couldn't hear the storm. The breaking point came in 1974. A high school party, too much alcohol, a careless laugh. Then a boy said the sentence that detonated everything. "Hey, Scott, maybe you should ask your dad if he likes men or women before you try to be like him." Scott exploded. The rage he had swallowed for years finally erupted. The fight ended with the other boy bleeding, needing 6 stitches. Scott was expelled. His future collapsed overnight. But the real devastation came afterward. Paul Newman didn't show up, didn't call, didn't write. Instead, he sent a lawyer a thick envelope, money to make the problem disappear, cold, efficient, silent. No hug, no reassurance, no father. Scott came home shattered. He grabbed one of his old school awards, threw it into the fireplace, and screamed words that finally cracked the house open. "You don't protect me. You don't protect Mom. So who are you really?" No one answered. Not Paul, not Joanne, not the walls filled with trophies. A year later, Nell found something she was never meant to see. A small notebook hidden under a Scott's mattress. The pages were messy, soaked with tears, words written in desperation. One line crushed her chest when she read it. "If he doesn't really love Mom, then who am I? Was I born out of love, or just to protect his image?" That question haunted Scott, and soon the outside world began to whisper the same thing. In 1977, a black and white photograph exploded across tabloids. Malibu Beach. A man who looked exactly like Paul Newman, walking barefoot, hand in hand with another man. No scandalous poses, just intimacy. Hollywood panicked, and the Scott paid the price. Just days before his first major film role, the call came. He was out, no explanation. Later, in a studio hallway, Scott overheard a producer murmur words that finished him. "Audiences won't buy him as a hero if his father's living a double life." That sentence shattered what little hope he had left. That night, Scott stood in the bathroom, shattered the mirror, and dragged glass across his wrist. Not deep enough to die, deep enough to scream. His mother did. Paul wasn't there. He was in New York, spotted with a close companion. After that, Scott withdrew completely. He changed his number, slipped into drugs, not chasing pleasure, trying to numb the pain of a father who never truly saw him. The last time Nell spoke to her brother, his voice was hollow. He asked one final question. "Do you think Dad ever truly loved anyone?" Nell couldn't answer. A month later, on November 20th, 1978, police forced their way into Scott's apartment. They found him on the floor, pills nearby, a half-empty bottle of red wine. On the television, Paul Newman smiled as he accepted an award. The report called it a drug overdose. But Nell felt something colder. Scott didn't die from drugs. He died from silence. And with his death, the cost of Paul Newman's secret became impossible to ignore. By the winter of 1981, the Newman house in Westport had become quieter than ever. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a warning, like everyone inside is holding their breath, afraid that one wrong word might finally crack the whole illusion wide open. Snow pressed against the windows, the yard disappeared under white, and Nell, now 22, moved through the hallway like she'd learned to do her entire life, carefully, softly, as if the house could punish her for being too real. She was heading to the kitchen to grab a blanket when she froze. A thin line of warm yellow light was leaking from her father's study door. That door was almost always sealed, locked, protected like a vault. But this time it was half closed, and the light spilled onto the floorboards like a secret reaching out. What stopped Nell wasn't the light, though, it was the sound. A sigh, not an actor practicing breath, not exhaustion after work. It was something heavier, loaded, like years of a swallowed truth trying to crawl out of a man's chest. Her heartbeat climbed into her throat as she stepped closer and peered through the crack. There he was, Paul Newman, bowed at his desk, fountain pen moving fast across pages, not signing contracts, not reading scripts. He was writing a letter, a real letter, 3 full pages handwritten as if the words had been trapped inside him and he couldn't hold them back anymore. Nell recognized his handwriting instantly, the looping script he used on Christmas card to her mother, but the name at the top of the letter wasn't Joanne. It wasn't my love. It wasn't dearest wife. It wasn't anything that belonged to their 50-year marriage. It was 2 words that made the room tilt. Dear Red. Nell's breath caught so hard, it felt like pain. Dear Red, the one who reminds me that I am still human, not merely a symbol. That single sentence told her everything she had spent her entire life trying not to know. This wasn't business. This wasn't friendship. This was confession. In those pages, her father didn't mention awards, applause, or Hollywood greatness. He wasn't the legend the world worshipped. He was stripped down, raw, almost desperate, writing like a man who had spent decades playing the wrong role and was finally daring to admit it to the one person who made him feel real. He wrote about the desert light during filming, about quiet moments between takes, about a hand brushing a shoulder when no one was watching, about hotel rooftops where silence was safer than the truth because if either man spoke, the floodgates might open and never close again. And then one line landed so hard, it felt like it branded itself into Nell's memory. There was one night you looked at me, only looked, and I felt as if the whole world had forgiven me. Nell's hands began to shake as she read further, her pulse thundering so loudly she thought he would hear it through the door. Red, you didn't need to say a word. But if you ever walked into this room again and looked at me the way you once did, I would give up everything. The fame, the family, all of Hollywood. Everything. Fame, family, Hollywood. Nell felt her childhood collapse in a single heartbeat. Every stiff photo, every cold hallway, every locked door, every silence her mother swallowed. It all suddenly had a shape, a name, a reason, and then the phone rang in the next room. Sharp, sudden, like a gun shot through the moment. Paul stood up. His chair scraped softly. His footsteps moved away. Panic hit Nell like heat. She slid the pages back exactly where they had been, hands trembling so badly she could barely keep them straight. Then she stepped back into the hallway, trying to breathe normally, trying to look like a daughter who hadn't just read something that could destroy a family. But it was too late, because she understood now. Her father wasn't writing to just a friend. He was writing to the person who held his heart. And within weeks, the story says that truth didn't stay trapped in ink. It stepped out into the world in the most dangerous way possible. Joanne Woodward was in California for work when she suddenly canceled everything and rushed back to Connecticut after receiving a call with no name attached, no number, no context, just one icy sentence. If you still care about your marriage, go to the Mayflower Hotel, room 708. That was it. No explanation, no mercy. That same night, Paul told Joanne he had a business meeting in New York, a script discussion, work, like always. But in this story, the partner wasn't a producer, it was Red. No one can prove what happened inside that hotel room. The doors stayed locked, the truth stayed sealed. This is all framed as memory and rumor, not confirmed fact. Still, what happened next, Nell says, felt like proof enough. When Joanne returned home, her silence was loud. Her face was pale, her eyes were puffy under makeup, and there was what looked like a dark bruise on her arm, the kind you get from being grabbed too tightly. She didn't tell Nell a thing, but that night, the mansion finally made noise, not shouting, just crashing. Glass and porcelain breaking behind the bedroom door. One of Joanne's prized Italian lamps shattered like ice across the floor, then nothing again, just that suffocating silence that always came after destruction. Afterward, Paul changed. He started smoking again. After quitting years earlier, he barely slept. He sat outside on the porch past midnight, staring into the dark, like he was searching for an answer he could never say out loud. Sometimes Nell would catch him frozen in front of a mirror, fist wrapped around his fountain pen so tight his knuckles went white, as if the pen carried all the words he refused to speak. And one evening, when a Beatles record slipped from Nell's hands and cracked on the floor, the sound made Paul snap. He turned without a word, grabbed the crystal vase they'd received on their wedding day, and smashed it against the table. No yelling, no explanation, just shards of glass and a man walking away, leaving the room full of broken memories nobody dared to touch. From that point on, Joanne never called him honey again, never called him my love. Those words died somewhere between that letter and that hotel room. When a reporter later asked her about Robert Redford, she didn't offer the story. She didn't smile. She didn't pretend. She answered with two words that sounded like a grave being filled. That man. And for Nell, the message became painfully clear. Her parents' marriage wasn't a love story anymore. It was a 50-year performance by two of the best actors Hollywood had ever produced, and one letter, one call, one locked hotel room was enough to tear the script apart. But just when Nell thought she had finally discovered the deepest secret in her father's life, something even more shocking was waiting. Because Red might have been the most important name in her father's heart. But he wasn't the only one. And in the marble-bright lobby of a New York hotel, Nell would soon witness a moment that made her realize the truth was bigger, darker, and far more complicated than she ever imagined. For years, Nell tried to believe the letter was the deepest truth she would ever uncover. She told herself that whatever her father had hidden lived in the past, that the worst damage had already been done. that nothing else could possibly break the illusion any further. She was wrong, because in 1981, in the marble-bright lobby of a luxury New York hotel, Nell Newman saw something with her own eyes that no rumor, no letter, and no whisper could ever compete with. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. Nell had just finished a promising internship interview. She stopped by the hotel to drop off documents for her mother. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just another quiet task in a life trained to avoid confrontation. Then the elevator doors opened, and time froze. Down the corridor, glowing under warm golden lights, stood her father, Paul Newman. But he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was Gore Vidal, a longtime family friend, a sharp-tongued intellectual, a man who had been around the Newmans for decades. Only this time, the distance of friendship was gone. Nell watched as Gore's hand brushed lightly against her father's wrist, just for a heartbeat, subtle, almost invisible, but loud enough. Paul turned toward him and smiled, not the polished Hollywood smile, not the public one, a private smile, the kind that doesn't exist without intimacy. They stood close, too close for coincidence. Two men in dark overcoats, shoulder to shoulder, so near that a single breath could have closed the gap between their faces. It wasn't vulgar, it wasn't reckless. It was quiet, natural, and impossible to misunderstand. Then Paul looked up, and he saw her. Nell would later say that look stayed with her forever. It wasn't panic, it wasn't guilt. It was something far worse, a silent plea. Please don't say it. Please don't make me explain. Please let this stay buried. For a long moment, no one moved. The hallway felt like it stopped breathing. Gore glanced at Nell and offered a calm, polite smile, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. As if the floor beneath her childhood hadn't just split open. Then Paul stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut slowly, like a curtain falling at the end of a play, and the secret sealed itself between them. From that moment on, Gore Vidal didn't fade from the Newman household. He hovered, a late-night phone call here, a sudden visit there, small handwritten notes left near the phone. G called back. Nell began noticing photographs tucked away behind family portraits, black and white shots, Paul and Gore by a lake, standing back to back, both staring into the distance like they shared the same unspoken thought. It didn't look like friendship. It looked like a line crossed long ago and never uncrossed. Unable to carry it alone anymore, Nell finally asked her mother the question she had been avoiding her entire life. Do you think Dad isn't the man you always thought he was? Joanne Woodward didn't react right away. The Oscar-winning actress who once played women with fractured identities went completely still. Then she spoke quietly, choosing every word like it might break something fragile. There are some things no one ever teaches us how to put into words, she said, but they still exist every single day, even when we pretend to forget. That was enough. Silence had become the family's second language, and by now it was shouting. As for Gore Vidal, he never publicly confessed to anything, not once. But years later, in his memoir Palimpsest, he wrote a line that made Nell's stomach drop. There are men who will never belong to us, but every time they smile, we feel alive. He never named Paul Newman. He didn't have to. Reporters connected the dots instantly. Gore had never written like that about anyone else. And when asked directly years later if Paul Newman had been the greatest love of his life, Gore paused, raised his glass, took a slow sip, and said, We shared nights that neither of us ever wanted to leave. That is all I can say. No follow-up questions were needed. But Nell didn't need interviews or memoirs anymore. She already knew. By the early 2000s, as her mother's memory began to fade, one name refused to disappear from Joanne's mind. Not Paul, not Nell, not her children, but another man, Robert. At first, Nell assumed it was confusion, Alzheimer's playing tricks. But nurses started whispering about nights when Joanne jolted awake, eyes clear for just a moment, speaking fragments that felt too precise to ignore. A strange perfume, unanswered calls, a hotel room in New York, and finally one name spoken slowly, painfully, like it had been waiting decades to escape. Robert Redford. That name ripped open a memory Nell had buried so deeply she'd almost convinced herself it never happened. Because years earlier, as a teenager, she had once skipped a school, taken a train to New York, and wandered into the Essex house. And there, she had seen her father step out of an elevator with Robert Redford beside him, laughing softly, walking close, Paul's hand resting briefly on Robert's shoulder. Not scandalous, just real. Nell had locked that moment away to protect the fragile illusion holding her family together. But now, hearing her mother whisper the same hotel, the same ache, the same unspoken betrayal, the truth came roaring back. The silence wasn't accidental. It was chosen. And it had cost them everything, because what Nell would soon learn is that this silence didn't end with hidden love or broken hearts. It followed her father all the way to his final act. And when Paul Newman died, the truth he never spoke would return in the most brutal way imaginable, written in ink, signed in law, and aimed directly at his own family. By the time Joanne's mind began slipping away, Nell thought she had already survived the worst part of her father's secret. She had seen the tension. She had heard the whispers. She had watched her brother break. She had read the letter that never should have existed. She had carried memories that felt too heavy for one lifetime, and still part of her clung to one fragile belief, that whatever Paul Newman truly was deep down, he would never destroy his family in the end. Not intentionally, not in writing. But then Paul Newman died, September 26, 2008. The world mourned like it had lost a saint. Tributes played non-stop. Clips rolled across television screens. Co-stars praised his integrity. Fans cried over the loss of the man with the famous blue eyes and the kind heart. Hollywood told a story the world wanted. The devoted husband, the loving father, the humanitarian hero. 3 days after the public farewell, reality knocked. Cold, formal, unemotional. Nell received a call from her father's private law office. The voice on the other end was detached, almost mechanical. We have officially activated the will according to Mr. Newman's instructions. Please check your internal mailbox. The division of assets has been completed. That was it. No condolences, no softness, no, we're sorry for your loss. Just business. And in that moment, Nell felt something twist in her stomach, because the tone sounded like they weren't dealing with a grieving daughter. It sounded like they were dealing with a problem. When Nell sat down with the papers, her breath snagged. Line after line felt worse than the last, because according to this account, the will did not read like the family expected. It didn't feel like a man leaving behind love. It felt like a man building a wall. In this story, Joanne Woodward, his wife of 50 years, was essentially written out, not honored, not protected, not even acknowledged the way the world assumed she would be. And the children who had lived in the shadow of his name were left with almost nothing in comparison to what they believed had been promised. But the most chilling detail wasn't what they received. It was who held the power. A single name kept appearing like a quiet shadow: Robert Forrester, a business associate, a close friend, and a man always mentioned, rarely explained, and now inked across the final pages of Paul Newman's life, positioned as the one person entrusted with control. The shock wasn't just money, it was the message, because money can be argued over. But a message like this felt personal. It felt deliberate. Then the lawyer read the line that dropped like a blade into Nell's chest. Anyone who contests this will forfeit even the small cash allocation provided. A warning, a trap, a final act of control from beyond the grave. Nell looked at her siblings and saw it on their faces. This wasn't just grief. This was abandonment. She turned to her sister and whispered something that sounded impossible even as she said it. We didn't just lose our father, we lost the chance to ever really know who he was. And the deeper Nell looked, the darker the story became, because there were whispers of a confidential addendum, a private trust, a plan that had existed beneath the official documents like a second heartbeat, a trust with a name that sounded innocent, almost poetic, the quiet legacy. But the wild part wasn't the name, it was the beneficiary. Not Joanne, not the children, not the family, two initials, R and R. Those letters hit Nell like a blow to the ribs, because she had already lived inside a lifetime of clues pointing to one man, Robert Redford. And once those initials surfaced, the media pounced the way it always does when it smells blood under glamour. Old rumors were dragged back into the light. The private trips, the glances in interviews, the whispers that had hovered for decades. People rewound old footage, searching faces for secrets. They weren't asking, was it true? They were asking, how long has it been true? And for Nell, the most painful part wasn't the gossip. It was what it implied. That her father's final loyalty was not to the woman who stood beside him for 50 years, not to the children who carried his name, but to a hidden life he protected until his last breath. Then came another twist that made Nell feel physically sick, because according to this narrative, the final will signed close to the end wasn't the version the family believed existed. It had been rewritten, stripped down, sealed in cold legal language, and it didn't just reduce the family's role in his legacy, it erased them. In this account, everything moved into one entity: the foundation, the name, the machine that would keep Paul Newman alive forever as a brand. And sitting at the top of that empire was Robert Forrester. Suddenly, the story wasn't only about love, it was about control. Who controlled his image, who controlled the money, who controlled what the public would be allowed to believe. And Nell, the daughter who once believed she was carrying her father's mission forward, found herself pushed out like a stranger, dismissed, shut out, cut off. Not only from the fortune, but from the identity. And that's what destroyed her, because the pain wasn't just financial, it was spiritual. It felt like being told in the coldest way possible, you were never part of the real story. And when Nell finally broke her silence publicly, her words carried no greed, no hunger for wealth, just something raw and human. I never asked for a dime, she said in this account, but I couldn't bear to see them turn my father into a brand and cast my mother aside as if she was never part of his life. That line didn't sound like a lawsuit. It sounded like a daughter begging the world to understand what had been stolen. Not money, meaning. And as more whispers surfaced, another terrifying question began to spread in the background, like a shadow crawling up a wall. What if Paul Newman wasn't fully himself when he signed those final papers? What if the last will wasn't truly his last decision? And if that was even possible, then the real story wasn't only that Paul Newman kept secrets. It was that someone may have used those secrets to take everything. And that's when Nell stopped asking who her father loved and started asking something far more dangerous. Who was really behind his final will? After the will surfaced, Nell didn't sleep, not because of money, but because the paperwork didn't feel like her father's voice. It felt like something colder, something engineered, like a final decision made with zero tenderness, zero hesitation, and zero trace of the man the public believed Paul Newman was. And the more she replayed the last year of his life in her mind, the more one terrifying thought kept crawling back. What if Paul Newman wasn't fully lucid when he signed it? That idea would have sounded insane if the whispers hadn't already begun. Quietly, in corners where the cameras never looked, people who had been around Paul in his final years began describing changes that didn't match the legend. Forgetfulness, confusion, mood swings, moments where he seemed distant, not emotionally, but mentally, like he was slipping in and out of the room even while he was still sitting in it. Nell began connecting dots she hadn't wanted to connect. The sudden rewriting of the will, the way the legal language felt sealed and absolute, the speed at which control shifted. And then came the detail that made her blood run cold. There were claims of medical records tied to a New York clinic suggesting Paul had shown signs of decline by mid-2007, and worse, whispers that by May 2008, only months before the final will, doctors had reportedly described him as temporarily incapable of making complex legal decisions. Temporary incapacity. Those two words were a bomb, because if that was true, then the signature at the bottom of those pages wasn't just a signature. It was a weapon. And according to this narrative, the most disturbing part wasn't that those records existed. It was that they vanished, not filed, not debated in court, not explored in public, just gone, like someone had wiped fingerprints off glass. Then another rumor surfaced, even darker. An anonymous source tied to Paul's legal circle allegedly described a handwritten letter Paul wrote to Joanne in June, shortly before his death. A letter that contradicted everything in the will. A letter where he apologized. A letter where he admitted fear. A letter where he begged forgiveness if something went wrong after he was gone. If that letter was real, then Paul Newman may have known something was happening around him, and that possibility cracked the entire story wide open. Because the question suddenly wasn't only why did he do this, it became what if he didn't? As the whispers spread, different outlets were said to pick up the trail. Investigations were mentioned, quiet probes, reporters and independent lawyers combing timelines, searching for the point where Paul's control ended and someone else's began. And as the spotlight shifted, Robert Forrester's role felt bigger, heavier, and harder to ignore. Because once he held the reins, the foundation that had once looked like Paul Newman's heart in action began to feel colder in the eyes of those watching. There were claims he increased compensation while budgets tightened elsewhere. Programs tied to the Newman family name reportedly changed shape, were restructured or cut back. Charities that once felt protected by Paul's personal mission began to feel like they were being managed by someone with a different set of priorities. And what hit Nell hardest was the symbolic cruelty of it all. The Newman name stayed. The Newman story stayed. The Newman brand stayed. But the Newman family was pushed out of the frame. It felt like watching your own father turned into a product, while your mother, fading in memory, was treated like she never existed. Eventually, Nell reached a point where she couldn't live in questions anymore. She tried to fight. In this account, by 2020, she petitioned a Connecticut court to reopen the case. She wasn't just trying to reclaim assets, she was trying to reclaim truth. But the answer came back cold, insufficient evidence, case closed, door shut. And that should have been the end. But then, late in 2021, fate twisted the knife one more time. A former assistant sorting through donated books at the Westport library found a worn copy of a book. Inside it, tucked between pages like it had been waiting for years, was a faded handwritten note. The handwriting looked like Paul's. The message was short, but it hit like a final heartbeat. My dearest Joanne, if I am no longer lucid enough to say this to you directly, then read it here. Everything belongs to you, from the name to the career to the reason I still exist after all these years. If anything goes astray, believe that I did not choose it. I love you until the very end. Paul. It wasn't legal proof, but emotionally, it changed everything, because it sounded like the voice the will did not have. It sounded like a man who knew he might lose control, a man who feared being misrepresented after death, a man leaving a lifeline for the woman he had spent a lifetime trapping inside silence. And for Nell, that note did something courts could never do. It gave her one last glimpse of her father as a human being, not a myth, not a brand, not a flawless legend, just a man, frightened, complicated, and painfully aware that truth was slipping away from him. When asked later if she still wanted the case reopened, Nell's answer in this narrative wasn't triumphant. It was exhausted. There are things that can't be reclaimed with paperwork, she implied. But I believe my father left the truth somewhere, and that belief became the final thread, holding her together, because even if she never wins in court, even if she never gets a clean confession, even if she never hears the words out loud, she still holds on to one haunting possibility, that Paul Newman didn't just leave behind films and fame, he left behind fragments, a trail, a mystery, and a question that refuses to die. Was his final act really his? Or was it the last and cruelest consequence of a lifetime of secrets? After the court doors closed, Nell told herself she should let it go, not because she believed the truth had been answered, but because she could feel what this fight was doing to her. The endless paperwork, the cold legal language, the quiet invisible war where every step forward felt like walking into a locked room with no key. And yet the strangest part wasn't losing a case. The strangest part was watching her father's legacy keep living without his family inside it, because from the outside, everything still looked beautiful. The name Paul Newman still carried weight. The foundation still carried money. The brand still carried trust. The story still carried the myth. People still spoke about him like a saint. But for Nell, something about it began to feel wrong in her bones. It wasn't grief anymore. It was something colder. It felt like watching a statue of your father standing in a public square, while the real man, the complicated man, the human man, was buried in silence under the ground with everything he never said. And the more the foundation grew, the more it seemed to harden into something different, something corporate, something polished, something that didn't resemble the voice she remembered at all. In her mind, her father's legacy had always been personal, a mission, a promise, a way to use fame to do something good while the world watched. But now, even that mission felt like it had been turned into a machine. And the most painful detail of all was the symbolic cruelty. The Newman name stayed, but the Newman family didn't. Nell, who once believed she was her father's spiritual heir, the one meant to carry his light forward, began to feel like she'd been erased from the very story she lived inside, like her page had been ripped out. And what does that do to a daughter? It makes her question everything she ever thought she knew about love. Because love, real love, leaves traces. It leaves warmth. It leaves proof. But Nell's entire childhood, her brother's entire collapse, her mother's entire silence, it all pointed to the same brutal truth. In their house, love had been something you performed, not something you shared. And when the performance ended, the silence didn't stop. It simply moved into paperwork, policies, locked doors, and final decisions. That's what made Nell's pain so complicated. She wasn't standing there screaming that her father was a monster. She wasn't trying to destroy him. She still loved him. That was the tragedy. Even after everything, she still carried the love of a daughter who wanted one impossible thing. Not money, not revenge, just one honest moment, a moment where her father looked his children in the eyes and said the truth, without hiding, without pretending, without letting silence do the talking. Because even a hard truth is lighter than a lifetime of unanswered questions. And now, all Nell had left were fragments. A brother lost to despair, a mother fading into memory, a father turned into a perfect myth the world refused to question, and a legacy that kept growing, while the people who knew the pain were pushed further into the shadows. In the end, Nell realized the real wound wasn't the will. It was what the will represented, distance. A final act that felt like the same distance she had felt her whole life. Not just distance created by death, but distance created by choices. Choices made again and again to protect an image, even if it crushed the family living behind it. And that's why the story doesn't end with a courtroom. It ends with a question that is bigger than Paul Newman, bigger than Hollywood, bigger than fame, because if a man praised for integrity can spend his whole life hiding who he truly is and leave his family trapped in silence, then what does that say about all the legends we worship? And what does it say about us? When we choose the myth over the truth? Nell doesn't end her story with hatred. She ends it with something quieter, a kind of a stubborn, aching love that refuses to die. But even love can't replace what was never spoken. And that is the final tragedy. Not the fortune, not the rumors, not even the scandal. The tragedy is that the people closest to him were left standing outside the door forever, still asking the same question: who was Paul Newman, really? And did he ever live as himself before it was too late?